I'm pleased to introduce our next guest. She spends her days studying the teenage brain. Pretty cool, very intense. She's Dr. Adriana Galvan. She's a professor at UCLA, where she is director of the Developmental Neuroscience Laboratory. She's a graduate of Columbia University and earned her PhD at Cornell. She has dozens of publications to her name, many of them supported by the prestigious National Science Foundation. Please help me in welcoming Adriana.
Thank you, Jordan, for the introduction. And don't go too far, because we'll talk about your brain in a few minutes. Thank you so much for being here today and for your attention for what I'm about to tell you about the adolescent brain. Brain development early in life is very important. And we know that because there's been research conducted in this area from labs all around the world, including right here in Seattle by Pat Kuhl and Andy Meltzoff at the University of Washington. But more recent research has shown that adolescence, or the teenage years, is an equally vital period of brain development. The brain maturation that occurs during this time helps individuals become confident and independent adults, seeking out new adventures, making new friends, and becoming more and more self-reliant. These are all behaviors that are at the very core of transitioning into this confident and independent state of adulthood. In fact, evolutionary psychologists believe that all of this is a big part of our species' success. We need every generation to strike out on its own, to push us forward, and to make new discoveries. However, along the road to autonomy, the very same brain regions that make us seek independence also lead teens to stumble into potentially harmful behaviors, especially when mixed with temptation and with bad peer influence that is prevalent during adolescence. Earlier research on the teen brain found strong evidence that the reason teenagers take risks and make poor choices and generally act before they think is because the prefrontal cortex, which you may have heard of, which is the part of the brain right up here, right above your eyes and just beneath the surface of your brain, is not fully developed until people reach their mid-20s. And this is the part of the brain you need to make good choices and to regulate your behavior. However, we now know that the story is far more complex and interesting than just the development of the prefrontal cortex. Yes, it's true that this delayed development contributes to what we think of as characteristic adolescent behavior. But changes that happen in the emotional and reward regions of the brain are also really crucial to understanding adolescent behavior. And the part of the brain that houses the limbic and emotional systems is called the limbic system. Now, you already know where the prefrontal cortex is, as I just told you. But this cool video shows you where the limbic system is located in the deeper layers of the brain. And you can't see it from the surface of the brain. And both of these brain systems undergo significant development during adolescence. But the catch is that they're not synchronized in their development. And in fact, the emotional systems are more reactive during adolescence, while the prefrontal cortex is trying to catch up. And so this tension between the regulatory systems on the one hand and the emotional systems on the other is what leads to the behaviors we often see in teenagers, including the risk-taking and the desire and the strong influence by peers. For those of you who are Star Trek fans, if there are any in the audience, you can kind of think of it like a Spock versus Kirk relationship where there's tension there. So how have we learned so much about the adolescent brain? Well, it's kind of hard, but to study the brain in motion, we can do that with brain imaging. We take pictures of the brain while kids are performing really simple video games that are kind of fun for them, but really informative for us. So for instance, there's a researcher in Pittsburgh named Bea Luna who's really interested in cognitive control, and that's just a fancy way of saying behavioral regulation. And she uses what's called an anti-saccade task. And it's such a simple task that I would love for all of you to join me in some audience participation. Are you guys interested? Okay, great. All right, so what's going to happen is that every time I raise my hand to your left, I want you to look to the right. Really simple, right? Are you guys ready? Okay, here we go. Not everyone's awake. Let's try it again. Okay. Okay, the second time most of you got it. So you can see that this is a really simple task, but you do make errors because your brain has to stay focused on what the ultimate goal of the task is. And what Dr. Linda finds is that teenagers can perform this game as well as adults. But two things need to happen. They need to be really focused on the goals, and it doesn't hurt to pay them. When they pay them, they perform much better. And so what happens is that their brains become less distractible and more interested in the goals. So if teens can think as well as adults, why do they take more risks? Why do they make poorer choices than adults? We used to think it was because they didn't appreciate the consequences of their actions, or they didn't understand the dangers. But that's actually not true. And in fact, it has more to do with the fact that they weigh the risk versus the reward differently than adults. In situations where risk can get them something that they want, they value the reward more heavily than the adults do. Now, how do we know that teens value rewards more than adults? And what does this look like in the brain? Well, we know because their brains told us in a very simple experiment we recently did. It examined how the brain responds to something everybody finds rewarding. Now, I'm not talking about money, although that does work. The teenager brain is more excitable in response to money. But we use sugar. So I'd like to bring Jordan back on stage, and let's ask him how he feels. Jordan, what about you? How about a Butterfinger?
I would love one.
All right, so just like most people, Jordan, even at 8 in the morning, is really excited about that sugar. Now, if I were to give Jordan a brain scan right now, here's what I would find. Like all people, he really likes the sugar. But if you notice this middle orange bar here, it shows that the teenage brain is significantly more exaggerated in response to the reward, to the sugar. So in other words, even to the simplest form of reward, the teen brain is simply more excited by it. It's more juiced up in response to the same reward. So what is that kind of responsiveness to reward, which is, by the way, not only true for our friend Jordan, thank you, Jordan, but it's true for all teenagers. Are there things that we can do to keep teenagers from wildly seeking sensations and taking risks in order to obtain a sense of reward in the brain? Well, my laboratory is looking into this. And one thing we've examined is social relationships. Because we know that there can be negative peer influence during adolescence, and it's quite powerful for teenagers compared to adults. And what we did is we wondered whether positive social influence is as powerful. And specifically, we tested whether strong family relationships can help buffer teenagers from this overactive or exaggerated reward system. And using brain imaging, we found that teenagers who reported a strong sense of family unity and support showed less activation in these reward regions than those who feel less connected to their family. In a separate study, we looked at teens who engage in what we call pro-social behavior, or behaviors that help others by volunteering or other acts of kindness. And in these teens, we found that their reward systems light up while they're helping others. They find it very rewarding, even at the level of the brain. But that's not all we found. We were intrigued to find that they are less likely to stumble into these risky behaviors like aggression and drug use. And so these studies tell us that social relationships can have both negative effects, but also positive ones as well. Now, there's one last study I want to talk about that tells us something about how environmental or circumstantial things can influence brain development or brain activation. And this study had something to say about sleep. What we found is adolescents need a lot of sleep, right? But that's not news. You don't need me to tell you that. Instead, what is news is that when teens don't get enough sleep, it actually affects how their brain responds to rewards. Not getting enough sleep leads to greater activation in reward systems and increases how much risk-taking teenagers do. In other words, when they're sleep deprived, they're more likely to engage in risky behavior. So together, all of these studies show that the fast-developing teen brain has both great strengths on the one hand, but is also vulnerable to significant negative outcomes. But the good news is that there are things we can do as a family and as communities to help kids make it through and thrive during this often challenging transitional period of development. Social support, and pro-social activities can make a big difference for this amazing group of human beings. And so can a good night's rest.
Adriana,
Yeah.
I have a question.
Okay.
My friends and I often feel really stressed. When my parents say, what have you really got to worry about? Just wait until you're out in the real world and trying to make a real living. When you look into our brains, does our stress look any different from adult stress?
It actually does. Teens do feel really stressed, not only because you have a lot of new challenges, but your bodies and mind are not yet adapted to respond to stress. And we see this because you have higher levels of cortisol or stress hormones. You also show greater activation in the brain in response to stress. So you have good reason to be stressed out.
That explains a lot.
Okay.
Dr. Adriana Galvan, thank you very much.
Thank you.